Hey folks, David Molnar here. Welcome back to the free video series on Aperture. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to actually change your aperture on a camera that looks just like yours. So before I jump into showing you how to twist the dials and change your aperture that is measured in an increment called f-stops, first thing I want to talk about is that to control exposure, okay, exposure is the brightness, and to get a correct exposure, you want to get an image that is not too dark or not too light, right? And that's based on what the photographer thinks it should be. Now, what determines a correct exposure is three factors. There is aperture, which is what we've been talking about this entire video series, which of course is the size of the hole. There is shutter speed, which is the duration of time that you are actually snapping or shooting the image itself. And then lastly, there is ISO, which is not an acronym, but it is the light sensitivity of your sensor that's inside your camera, okay? Those three factors determine the brightness or exposure of an image. When you want to change your aperture, you need to consider all three of the factors, because if you change the aperture, it directly affects the other two factors as well. So basically, if you want to change your aperture, you have to pay attention and change your ISO and your shutter speed accordingly to make sure that you still maintain a correct exposure. But here's the cool thing. That's all if you're in manual mode. And manual mode is amazing. It's the best mode there is out there. It's what professionals use, and it's what you should aspire to achieve, is shooting photos in manual mode every single time. But there's kind of like a cheat mode, or more like a starter mode, where you can change your aperture and the camera will automatically change the shutter speed and the ISO for you so that you don't have to think about it, okay? I'm not talking about automatic mode. Automatic mode changes everything and you don't even have a say in the equation. Like, basically the camera will just guess what you think and just calculate all that stuff for you. But when you use the mode that's called Aperture Priority, you can set the aperture to the size of the hole that you want because you have a specific result that you want to achieve. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, you can set the size of the hole, the aperture, that's measured in f-stops. You can set it to f4, you can set it to f2.8, you can set it to f1.8 if your lens allows, or you can set it to f22, and your camera is going to do the calculations for you and set the duration of time, which is shutter speed, and the light sensitivity, which is called ISO, for you so that you don't have to think about it. So it's a great way to learn how to use aperture and to start really understanding from a practical perspective how aperture works and what it does and how it affects depth of field and several other things as well. So really, you want to work towards manual mode, but Aperture Priority is a fantastic mode, a semi-automatic mode that you can use to kind of like take some baby steps to get you on your way to shooting in manual full time. So we're going to go ahead and jump over and watch some lessons on how to change your aperture in Aperture Priority mode and also in manual mode as well. Hey folks, David Molnar here, your photography mentor. In this lesson, I want to teach you how to change your aperture in all three of these different cameras, okay? We have the Sony a6500, the Canon Rebel, and we have the Nikon D3400 as well. So let's go ahead and use the Canon first. First thing I'm gonna do is turn the camera on because that's kind of important. We all know that, right? And at the moment, I'm in manual mode. What I wanna do is show you guys Aperture Priority mode. Aperture Priority on the Canon says AV for Aperture Priority. Technically AV stands for aperture value, but it's an aperture priority mode. It's the same mode that on the Nikon and the Sony say A. Okay, so what we're gonna do is in aperture priority mode, we have a dial up here on the top, okay, a spinning wheel, and that wheel is really cool. Okay, it turns the aperture when you twist it. You can see this right here, it says f8.0, okay, and as I twist that dial, it's changing the aperture. The cool thing about it, of course, is it's changing this as well, which is the shutter speed. It's automatically calculating that stuff for you, okay? So that's where you change it. Now, it switches up a little bit when we switch over into manual mode because you can control all three factors, so it becomes a teeniest bit more complicated to change the aperture, but not a lot. Let me show you. All you have to do to change the aperture is press and hold this button that says AV, okay, for aperture value. So you press, and you can actually see this little like selection icon, or like icons that are currently surrounding the shutter speed, switch over to the aperture one. And then once you press and hold it down, if I release it, it goes back. But if I press and hold it down, then I can twist that same dial up top, and now I can change the aperture. So if you want to change the aperture, press this button down, keep it pressed down, and then twist the dial, okay? That's how you change the aperture on the Canon camera. All right, I'll set this one over here. Next one I want to do is the Nikon. Of course, I'm going to turn that one on as well because that's super important, all right? So right now I've switched over to A, which is Aperture Priority. Same thing as AV on the Canon, it's A on the Nikon and the Sony, okay? In order to change the aperture, which is right here, all we do is twist this dial right here, this spinning wheel right here, twist it, you can see it changing to f/25, and it's actually automatically calculating the shutter speed and the ISO as well for you, but you're not actually, even though it looks like I'm changing the shutter speed, I'm actually only changing the aperture, and it's calculating the other things for me. So let's say if I wanted to go to f/5.6, I scroll over to it, and then it's gonna automatically calculate the other stuff for me. Now, if I wanna switch to manual mode, okay, not talking about manual focus, manual mode where I can set the brightness, the exposure manually for all three factors, the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture. Switch over to M for manual mode. And then it becomes the teeniest bit more complicated, again, to switch the aperture on this camera. On some other models, there's actually a dial up here that you can change the shutter speed and the aperture. You have two different dials, so they have designated dials or spinning wheels for the aperture and for the shutter speed. On this camera and this Canon camera, you do not. You have to press and hold a special button to be able to change the aperture. Because in manual mode, by default, this same spinning wheel will actually change the shutter speed. It doesn't change the aperture unless you press this button right here. It says plus and minus, but just above it is a little icon that shows an aperture symbol, and that icon is signifying that this is the button you want to push down to change your aperture. So if I press this button and hold it down, then I use the same dial and it will change the aperture for me, okay? And of course, if I release that button and just twist the dial, it's gonna change the shutter speed. So press it down, and that was the actual taking a picture. If I press it down, and then I can actually change the aperture. Okay, that's how you do the Nikon. And finally, let's take a look at the Sony a6500. I'm of course gonna turn the camera on, super important. All right, and now we have a very dark image in the back of our screen at the moment. In order to change, let's see, we are in manual mode. I'm gonna switch down to, on Sony, you have to skip over shutter priority to A for aperture priority. And now on the Sony, this dial up top does the aperture. It actually is a designated dial for the aperture. So in both modes, aperture priority and shutter priority, sorry, manual mode, not shutter priority, this dial, this spinning wheel is going to change your aperture in both of those settings, but I'll go ahead and demonstrate that for you. As I twist that dial, you can see the aperture, or the f-stop, set right now it says f18, you can see it changing as I twist that dial, okay? You can actually see it changing in real time right there, okay? And if I switch to M for manual mode, now I'm in manual mode, that same dial works the exact same way, okay? There is, I think, one extra set of dials on the A7 series. I believe it's like right up here or right on top, just like the Nikon. Like some of the other more expensive or full frame Nikons, they'll have another dial up here where one is designated for the shutter speed and one is designated for the aperture. But on these cameras, which are more the consumer level cameras, you know, the dials are more kind of on the back of the camera and you have a little bit less options, but that's fine. So this same dial works for both manual mode and for aperture priority mode. So, all right, Dave Molnar here. Hope you enjoyed this lesson and I'll see you soon. All right, so now that you've learned how to change the dials on your camera to take control of the aperture in both modes, in aperture priority mode and in manual mode, now the next thing we're going to talk about is the limitations that lenses can or cannot put on you while you're shooting photographs. I'll see you in the next lesson.